The evolution of monologue as an education. How does theatre become social theory? How is social theory converted into theatre? How do the culmination of these two ideas become education? In what contexts does education occur? On the stage? In the school classroom? In teacher training classes at university? I've recently been confronted with the question of the relationship between theatre and education in three somewhat diverse and yet similar contexts. Firstly, the autobiographical monologue, The Outcast Weekly Poets stage show. It describes experiences in a conversational style, and because experience and conversation are inevitably educational, that is, being is learning and listening is learning, I recently posed the question to a group of first-year education students: how is it possible not to learn? We didn't find an answer. Secondly, I explored the practice of monologue writing with a sample group of Australian school students in the subject of social labelling. Finally, a monologue writing workshop conducted with a group of teachers in training revealed the potential of monologue writing to foster empathy between teachers and their most difficult students. The Outcast Weekly Poet. I've always felt that my work as a theatre practitioner and researcher was philosophical, at least more than being entertainment. And there are numerous examples from my practice that illustrate this, such as barcode 30 exclamation mark 7307, an exploration into domestic violence and criminal behaviour. Or the recently performed Outcast Weekly Poets stage show, which I referred to above. Perceived by many critics as an expose on the troubles of people experiencing homelessness and drug addiction. This was curious for me because, for me, the work was merely describing my experience, which involved homelessness and drug addiction, but I never really considered that this was what the piece was about. I thought it was simply a description of my experiences. The idea that my work was associated with anything other than my own experience was strange for me, particularly with regard to this piece, which is almost entirely autobiographical. The perspective offered by my friend somehow suggested the work was in some way contrived, or at least an artifice, whereas I considered this work in particular to be just the opposite. I was merely engaged in conversation with an audience. So the play, in a sense, occurred in two contexts. The reality of the street, which involved a social encounter with a passerby where I would say, "Would you like a piece of poetry there today, sir?" And an encounter with an audience where I would ask a similar question, "Would you like a piece of poetry there today, sir?" Only this time on a stage in a theatre. The context was all that changed. 1.3. I think, therefore I am an educator. My PhD research involved applying my playwriting method to a group of secondary drama students to explore the idea of social labelling in education. One of the outcomes of this work was that I began to be called an educator by some I encountered, and I reacted with a little discomfort, wondering to myself how I became an educator, when I became an educator, and what it meant to be classified as an educator, when I never formally filled the position of teacher in any kind of classroom. Yet here I was, being called an educator. I should not feel insulted by this. I have nothing against educators. And like Brecht, I have often called my theatre education. It was just that identity being pinned to me, or to have the question raised, why do you not see yourself as an educator? It was something I couldn't move past. And I could never not be an educator after that, even if I found an answer to that question. The question itself proposes an answer, posed by Professor Tarquin McKenna, an internationally renowned drama education expert himself. It is linking drama and education in the same way that Brecht did when he said his theatre sought to educate. But it does it with a modernist twist. It is somewhat dramatic. Why do you not call yourself an educator? You are an educator, whether you like it or not. After all, you have argued that theatre is education, and now you argue that you are a theatre maker. If theatre is education, and you are a theatre maker, how could you not be an educator? Monologue writing in an educational setting. Monologue writing in a teacher training setting. I then expanded on the potential of monologues to educate, and with an experienced education academic, applied it in a teacher training setting. This involved inviting a sample group of teachers in training to write monologues with a view to fostering empathy for those students from whom they perhaps felt disconnected or troubled by. The idea was to bring oneself into the uncomfortable space of an identified other, one who is other than you, one who is not you. For the participating teachers, they were asked to imagine and inhabit the narrative and physical voices of their least favourite students, or those students with whom they felt a disconnect. Here is an example of the results. People, they think I'm stupid. Not smart, they think. He's dumb, they say. But they don't know, man. They have no idea. I just can't say what I want to say. The words they are hard, not easy to understand. In my own language, I could be a smart person, very famous. But in English, not much makes sense. In my own language, I could write anything I want to, and I could say things to make them make sense to you. It makes me angry. I know what I want to speak, but nothing comes out good. My teachers, they correct me all the time. I cannot speak good yet, miss. Give me time. No one speaks this language at home. I have to teach my big brother, but he is always busy, always tired. He gets angry too, but he is angry at all the people he goes to work with. They don't talk to him. They don't try. It's not fair, you know. We learn a whole new language. And they don't even try. And they think I'm stupid. Critical response. The student teacher here explores the problems of English as a second language and the barrier to education it tends to create. Through the use of monologue, the teacher fosters an empathetic position for her student, imagining the social situation and reality for an adolescent studying English when it is not their primary language spoken at home. Considering the task, one could interpret the language barrier as symbolic of any problem that makes a student feel different or like an outsider. This raises several questions. How is the playwright's practice in the theatre educational? How can monologue writing, for example, be used in educational settings, not just to learn about theatre and drama, but to learn about the world, ourselves, and others? I believe there is educational value in the form of documentary theatre referred to above, where we used the example of the street poet. But this becomes quite another process when we contemplate the formal transformation of the theatre making, monologue writing process from an arts context that appears to educate in the manner that is referred to by Brecht, when they explicitly state that the purpose of theatre is to consciously educate. When this is moved to an educational context where artistic practices are used to educate, the situation becomes quite different. These were questions I explored in my PhD research, which involved working with original monologues written by secondary drama students in a school classroom environment during a writing workshop conducted in collaboration with my supervisor and me as playwright researchers. The material was then collected and formed into a play, therefore blurring the lines between education and theatre practice, in a similar way to which the line between reality and fiction was somewhat blurred in the street poet example. How long have we got?
We're up to 15 minutes.
I will now present one example from the research that I believe illustrates the process of collecting material from the drama setting of the classroom and transforming it into a play in the same way that the street poet example is collected from experience on the street and then written into a theatrical presentation. So this monologue is conflated by myself. My brother calls me fat. He's a little shit. I get in trouble for calling him a little shit. But how much damage is done by that compared to him calling me fat? It's not his fault. He's 9. He probably doesn't even know what fat is. Do I really know? Why does it hurt so much being called fat? I mean, do I feel fat? Sometimes. Am I really fat though? I look in the mirror at myself sometimes and I can hear a little voice in my head saying, fat, fat, fat. And then I've got him in the background right behind me, and just as the imaginary voice fades out, I hear the little shit and see him smirking behind the mirror. So I'm not even looking at myself in the mirror, I'm looking at him. And maybe I'm seeing what he thinks. He says I'm ugly, but that doesn't matter because he's 9. He calls me lazy because I sleep till midday. But one day he will grow, and so will I, and I will shed my puppy fat and see myself as beautiful. He'll still want to know me because I'll be very cool. And I want to know him because I'll need my brother. But what if he's gone too far for me to love him anymore? What if I can't trust him? I get in trouble for sleeping late. Nobody would even notice if he didn't bring it up. He knows this. He thinks it's funny because he's 9. He's young, a child, but then so am I. Who isn't anyway? When do we stop being children? Being called fat makes me so lonely. I'm the loneliest person on the planet when he calls me fat. He laughs, he thinks it's funny. What's funny about my loneliness? Ha ha! She's alone. Ha ha! She's a monster, growing outward like an oil leak. Fat, fat, fat. How is that funny? I'm shouting, but nobody can hear me. Does he know how much it hurts? It's only because I'm a girl that it matters. I'm already seeing myself as fatter than I'm supposed to be. The last thing I need is the word being bleated out by a 9-year-old sheep. But that's just it. Who's he imitating? My brother calls me stupid, but it doesn't matter because he's 9. It can't matter. If it did matter, my brother will be more damaged than me. He's the one who's cruel. One day he will look in the mirror and he won't like what he sees. But he thinks it's a joke, so it's a joke. His names don't hurt because he's 9. It's me that does the hurting in my own thoughts about myself, not his names or labels. I remember being 9. I remember my mother looking at herself in the mirror back when I was a child and she was a woman, before I entered this age of uncertainty. Anyhow, she'd look at herself and describe herself as fat, grab tiny handfuls of skin and call them flab. Herself 10-ton Tessie when she was all skin and bones. What I can't work out is how I turned from being 9 and knowing the objective truth of what the mirror looked like. In conclusion, the relationship between education and theatre in this practice appears to exist at its very foundations. This is apparent in the example from direct practice explored at the opening of this paper. That is, the practice is educational a long time before it enters educational contexts. However, the process involved in collecting primary materials, whether they be from experience on the street or from educational encounters in a drama classroom, are remarkably similar and support Brecht's claim that theatre educates consciously, suggestively and descriptively. To this, we could add that it also educates practically or in practice.